It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
It's Take Command podcast. Craig Hoffman's still out, so you still get a little bit of Denton Day and Logan Paulsen. Logan, I hope you're doing well, my friend, and thank you for putting up with me for at least one more episode, barring any breaking news from the next couple of days.
No, man, I always enjoy doing shows with you. So this is a gift for me. You know what I mean? Craig gets a vacation. I get to hang out with you. I think that's a win-win for both of us.
I think he still gets a little bit of the better end of the deal, but I will take the compliment when it's given. So big week this week. We got first preseason game. We got a joint practice in a couple of days. We're going to get to that momentarily. But we started the week with the first unofficial in big bold letters. But the first unofficial depth chart of the season, Jayden Daniels listed at quarterback number 1. Really not a surprise there. I think all of us anticipated that he was going to be the starting quarterback come week 1 of the regular season, but it was nice to see it in print. Initial reaction to them naming him QB1.
I mean, I don't know if he's even named quarterback 1 yet, but, I think it just shows kind of the way this whole thing's been going. Like, you've been out to practice, you've seen him, you've been able to compare him to Marcus Mariota. And, not that Marcus has been doing anything bad. I think, they're just different. And I think it kind of shows you how special Jayden is. And when I look at, kind of the juxtaposition of the two of them, I think, Marcus has done some interesting stuff with his legs. I think he's made some nice throws down the field, but the consistency on a down-to-down basis just hasn't been there the way it's been with Jayden, which is, again, a testament to Jayden. That's not necessarily an indictment of Marcus. And I don't think Jayden's here without the support of Marcus. I think, one of the reasons they brought him in was because of his leadership and because of his ability to kind of help Jayden navigate this process, as the second overall pick to a new team. So I think they're kind of, working in conjunction. But I do think when you look at the practice production, it's Jayden. Now, I really got to just say this. Like, there are a lot of data points, evaluation data points, significant evaluation data points that still need to be looked at, right? I mean, that's why it's a preliminary depth chart. Obviously they've got the joint practice, they got the preseason, another joint practice, another preseason game. And so a lot can change. Like, I've been a part of teams where, I thought a guy was a lock to make the team. He goes into a joint practice or goes into a preseason game and kind of, misses the mark completely and puts himself in a bad spot. So I think, again, I don't think Jayden's going to do that. And even if Jayden did do that, I think he's still, on some level, he's probably quarterback 1. But I do think it's a testament to him. It's a testament to his professionalism, how he's learned the offense, and the standards that he's held himself to, because we talked about on the last pod just how effective he's been in practice. And I think, this is the reward for that.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned with the support of Marcus Mariota. There were a lot of questions, at least from the outside, when Mariota was brought in here, because the last time that a lot of fans in this town saw Marcus Mariota was on the Netflix series and his departure from Atlanta. And that wasn't exactly covered in a way that made him look awesome. Right. And then you kind of compare it to the quarterback room last year. And, I only got to practice once in training camp last year, but it just so happened to be the day that Jacoby Brissett was named QB number 2. And admittedly, I don't expect him to be thrilled that he is quarterback number 2, but you could see there was a little bit of unhappiness there from being around the team, significantly more than I am. This quarterback room does seem to have a very nice bond, being that they've only really been with each other for a couple of weeks. It's I don't know if Marcus Mariota and Jeff Driscoll maybe spent time together somewhere, but it's 4 dudes that have come in that really haven't spent a lot of time together in other stops.
And Dan's talked about that in his pressers multiple times, basically saying, talking about Sam Hartman specifically, a guy who's not getting a lot of reps, but is handling himself the right way in the quarterback room. And I think it applies to all 3 of those guys, all 4 of those guys, really, including Jayden, that they all seem to get along. They all seem to be kind of wired the right way. They're all kind of supporting and rooting for each other. So I definitely think it's a stark contrast to last year. And I think, rightfully so. Like last year, Jacoby, I think you could really make the argument that he won the battle, that he won the quarterback position, but they went with a younger guy who was a 5th round pick. And I think if I'm Jacoby, I'm like, they don't owe him anything. But I think if I'm Marcus in this situation, I understand that with the 2nd overall pick, that dude's playing at some point this year. Mm-hmm. And with how he's looked through training camp, it's probably going to be sooner rather than later. So I think the writing's been on the wall, and I think that's much more palatable. I think that's much more accessible for Marcus. I would assume, I haven't talked to him about it, but I would assume that's how he feels. So I think it's just a completely different situation. And because of Jaden being such a high pick. I think it just makes that delineation in the room so much clearer.
Last time we were on together early in the week, I asked you a question about the potential of a rookie quarterback with a rookie left tackle. And if we're just judging based off of this unofficial depth chart, you see Brandon Coleman slotted in to play left tackle. What did you think of that decision? And has your stance changed at all since the last time we spoke on that?
Not particularly. I think one of the things about Brandon Coleman is that we talked about the athlete last time, right? But I think we've also seen a growth and a maturation. I think when you watch him in practice, like, it's one thing to have 35-inch arms, but it's another thing to use them, right? It's a one thing to be 325, but it's another thing to be completely balanced in your stance and be able to move around. So I think you were starting to see signs of him progressing in a really nice way, and I think that's great. I think that's exactly what you want to see from that guy. Again, there's still a long road ahead, and really want to see him in practice against the New York Jets. But I will say he's definitely kind of answering the bell. For him, it feels a little bit more. I'm trying to think of a good example. Like Jaden, it feels obvious. It feels like he's ready. The moment's there. It feels like with Brandon Coleman, he will be ready. And I think like you're banking on him getting reps with Allegretti and getting reps with Biadasz and kind of working with that first group to kind of settle himself in, and assuming that over the next, 3 weeks, when it's time for the first game, like the growth that we've seen over the last 10 days will be actualized when the season starts. So again, you're making a little bit more of a gamble, I would assume, but I definitely think he's done enough in practice to warrant that kind of optimism by the coaching staff.
And that is one of the things that makes the joint practices excited, again, to see him go up against some of the teams that they will be spending some time on the practice field with, being that at least one of them has an absolutely silly defensive line. One of the other things that really stood out to me, how many receivers do you think they're going to end up keeping? Do you think it's 6, or do you think they potentially extend that number to 7?
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. So what is it? According to the depth chart, it's Terry, Jahan, OZ, Diami, and then I forget.
And then it's McCaffrey and Jamison Crowder.
Yeah, McCaffrey, Jamison Crowder. I think that could, and this is where I think the term kind of like unofficial depth chart comes in, because I think when you watch practice, like I come out of these practices like every day thinking Bryson Tremaine should be on the 53-man roster. And I know that this staff is smart. I know they have an appreciation for him. And so like that's one where he's way down the depth chart, but he's definitely one that I think could make some waves, So, and it also depends on what you do with the return game. Does Noah Igbenogany, is he returning kicks? Can he kind of do some stuff in terms of can he do some stuff with regards to returning punts? Can Mike Sanders still return punts? Can Forbes return punts? Because if one of those guys return punts, then maybe that Jamison Crowder position's a little bit more in flux. And again, I like Jamison. I played with him. He's a great dude, works hard, great pro. But again, like we understand that the bottom half of that 53 can be a little bit dicey. So I think you could easily keep 6. I think you keep 7 with a returner. But I think some of those defensive guys that I just mentioned, because of their return upside, depending on how they decide on using them, could be the returner. And if they do that, then obviously it makes a position, that extra receiver spot, a little bit less important.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Tremaine, because as it stood here right now, and this from my perspective was a very big overreaction. But with OZ being wide receiver number 3, you look at McCaffrey, and obviously they're going to keep McCaffrey. They just drafted him. They think very highly of him, and they want to give him time to develop. So that makes a ton of sense. Jamison has the ability not only just to be a return guy, but you mentioned he's a really good veteran to have who's been around a couple of organizations. And I think when you're building a foundation as an organization, it's good to have guys that have a little bit of experience in the game. And then if they only keep 6, then it does come down to Diami and Bryson Tremaine. Now, I think Dan Quinn has spoken very highly a couple of different times about Diami Brown and some of the things that they've seen. And, we've seen flashes, even back to like when he was playing with Carson Wentz, and we saw a little bit last year too. Like there's some flashes with Diami Brown, and you're just kind of like, man, if he puts everything together, like he could be a really good, wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 kind of a guy here. But it does, as we kind of get deeper into this, and I guess this weekend will give us a little bit of a better tell. I feel less sure that he is going to be on the 53. I'm not suggesting that he won't be, but I am feeling just a little less sure. Like maybe there is some wiggle room for someone else like a Bryson Tremaine to come up and earn that spot.
Yeah, I'm 100% with that. And again, that's why this is a preliminary unofficial depth chart, because I do think that like while like this might be how they feel today, because they have to put it out. Like if Diami continues to be quiet, maybe in the joint practice, and Bryson shows that he can win versus man coverage and create separation and still be that kind of 50-50 contest monster that he's been through training camp, I think he keeps making a case for himself, and he can play special teams. He's working as the PP, he's working as the guard, he's working as the wing on punt. Like they're finding ways to get him on the field. So I definitely agree with you. I do think that room specifically, I think still has a lot of and I think the whole roster, just to be clear, has a lot of evaluation still yet to kind of see through. So I'm not making any declarative statements yet, but I do think I think this group out of any of them is subject to change pretty dramatically.
Real quick, just to finish up the offense, have you seen anything from Jeremy McNichols that would suggest that maybe he gets that third running back spot over Chris Rodriguez? I've heard his name mentioned a couple of times this offseason.
Yeah, obviously McNichols is a guy that I played with, so it's cool to see, him kind of, I got him when he was like a second-year player when I was in San Fran, and then to see him kind of grow and become the pro that he is now, I think is pretty cool. I don't know. I kind of think the battle, honestly, is between it's Jeremy McNichols, Chris Rodriguez, Michael Wiley, and Austin Jones. Like all of those guys are clumped together. And I think the Michael Wiley, Austin Jones guy, specifically Michael Wiley, has made some waves from like a work ethic, finishing standpoint. He had an explosive play in practice. What day was that? Was that yesterday on Tuesday? So like I think it just comes down, honestly, with this group's in particular, to like how they look in the preseason game. I'm very doubtful. Like I think, Austin Eckler and B. Rob, they're for sure going to make the roster, and they're going to play as much as the starters are going to play. But in the first game, what is that traditionally, like 10 snaps, 15 snaps? So I think it's going to give, Adam Peters, Dan Quinn, and the rest of the staff, Cliff Kingsbury, an opportunity to look at these four remaining guys, McNichols included in that, and say, who is really the guy? And I think back to like Christian Rodriguez last year, and he's a guy that didn't really show well in practice. And they didn't do anything bad. But like when he puts the pads on, he's a different animal, And so I do think that that's going to be something cool to keep an eye on, is who can kind of separate themselves in this preseason, like from a physicality, from a pass protection standpoint, from a special team standpoint, to say, hey, I can add value to this team as the third back and potentially in some other areas on the roster. So while that's the depth chart at the moment, I do think those first two spots are pretty locked up. Like B-Rob's been a monster. Austin Eckler's been a monster in practice. Those other remaining four backs are going to be in a pretty stiff competition, but I do think it's great because I think they're going to get to play a lot in the preseason, and that's going to really help us as fans and the staff kind of finalize that evaluation.
What about on the defensive side? I looked at this and I saw three big takeaways that really jumped off the screen at me. When you looked at this roster or this unofficial depth chart for the first time, what was the one or two things that you saw and immediately caught your eye?
I mean, Jean-Baptiste working with the twos, I thought was kind of an interesting pick, interesting kind of thing. He'd been hurt for most of training camp, and to see him up there backing up Dorrance Armstrong, Cleveland Farrell, and Dante Fowler, I thought was kind of an interesting. I was a little surprised by that. And again, like that's not a knock on him, but I think it shows that the staff has a lot of faith in him and they want him to play a lot in this preseason game. I think the Emmanuel Forbes thing at corner was also really interesting. But again, the more I thought about that, the more I talked to Fred, the more I talked to Fletch, the more I kind of understood the dynamic of the group. I thought, this really doesn't mean anything. If anything, this is one of those things that is almost insignificant, because I still think because of the remaining time on the evaluation, this could flip on Thursday. This could easily go Michael Davis is the 2, Forbes is 1, and then the next time they do a depth chart, it switches. So I'm not even like, I was a little bit surprised by that, but like very mildly so. And the more I thought about it, the more I think it's probably those three guys in a 3-horse race. And the only reason you get Forbes second is because you have to give it some kind of order on a depth chart. It can't just be 3 across the top. So I think that's one that'll kind of declare itself moving forward.
Yeah, I'm glad you have a much your head's on a little straighter with that one, because I saw that one and I was like, ooh, that's pretty big. And then I opened up social media, which I shouldn't have done, but I did it. And everyone was, I mean, it was just like the house is on fire
Really?
type of deal, because, I think we've heard a lot of really good things about Emmanuel Forbes. And I don't know if it's just because people aren't asking a ton about Michael Davis, but like Dan Quinn's mentioned to me a couple of different times, but it feels like a lot of the conversation has been more centered around Benjamin St-Juste and Emmanuel Forbes. So there was a little bit of an uproar about him being the second string guy, knowing some of the issues that he had last year. But I mean, from the couple of drills that I got to see this past weekend, he looks way more confident.
Yeah.
And with DBs, it's probably like 60% of the battle is confidence, right? Like that's a position where if you don't have any swagger there, you're toast. And towards the end of last year, there was not a lot of swagger there with number 13, but he looks like he's way more comfortable. I mean, he's gotten bigger. I can definitely see in the upper body, by the way, that he's gotten bigger. The legs, not as much, but for some people that's tough, right? But the upper body, I can see that he's put on a decent amount of weight. From what I saw, he did look good. Now I'm treading carefully just because we kind of had the same conversation with him last year in the preseason. Then somebody stuck him on AJ Brown, and that didn't exactly go well. But I've liked what I've seen from Emmanuel Forbes. But there was a segment of the fan base that was very, very alarmed with him being the second string.
Yeah, but I also think it's important to remember that like we saw signs of that struggle in the joint practice versus Baltimore. Like he had a really hard time being kind of staying attached to receivers down the football field. And as well as I think he's practiced, like there's been a lot of explosive plays to Terry specifically over top of him, and I think he's still working through some stuff. I think he's been playing more physically. I think he's been playing with more confidence. I think his read and react stuff, especially underneath, is, at least to my eye, I can't speak, for what I'm seeing. I don't get to watch every rep, but at least to my eye, seems to have improved. But again, like, it's not like he's definitively said I should be the second guy. And so I think, it comes down to like a kind of 3-horse race, Michael Davis, St-Juste, and him. And I think they're going to figure something out. And I also think it's interesting, like, what do they do with guys that have more position flexibility? Like if Mike Sanders still has this nickel cornerback position locked down, but like Noah Igbenogany, I've been impressed with him at practice because he's physical, he's long, he's done well as the nickel. So does that give you some flexibility to like push somebody else outside? That's a little bit of a long shot in my opinion, but maybe. So I still think there is so much evaluation on this. And I think when you talk to Joe Witt Jr., one of the things he says is like, we want our best 11 out there, however that comes. And so, if those guys are the best players, they're going to play. So I don't think this is anything to like overreact to. I think it's just like, again, I think it's a 3-horse race. I think this will settle. I think once you get to the joint practices, like they're going to have a great opportunity to kind of show themselves against Garrett Wilson and some of these skill position players from New York. I think that's important to keep in mind. Like we will be talking about this differently tomorrow afternoon, 100%, because it's such a valuable piece of evaluation, getting those guys in a competitive environment against other people in situations that you can control as a coach. Like they're going to have a much better feel for who these guys are. Then you get the preseason game and who plays a lot in there and like, how do they do in that? Because that's, again, another critical data point. So I know this feels like a big deal. I know social media is probably on fire, but to me, this is a non-issue. Like this is part of training camp. It's a competition and that's what you want. Like if you're a fan, you should want this. You should want them pushing him like this. You don't want them anointing him if they haven't seen what they need to see from him, And I think that that's important to keep in mind when looking at these positions. Like, again, I think he's improved, but if he's not to where they think he needs to be, I'm going to trust Joe Witt Jr., man. That guy has coached defensive backs for a long time. He's coached a lot of good ones. He's coached a couple Hall of Famers. Like, he knows what he's looking for, and he knows what he's doing. And even if this is a ploy to kind of get Forbes to play better, like, I trust him, and I think they're going to make the best decision for this team and the best decision for both those players when it's all said and done.
It is very nice to have a coach that you trust working with those DBs. Final thing just on this before we jump into the joint practices, the linebackers, you got Wagner, you got Luvu, and you have Dante Fowler as the starters penciled in here. Jamin Davis behind Dante Fowler. Does Fowler have the natural outside linebacker kind of tendencies, or he feels like an edge guy?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about this depth chart when I was looking at it earlier is that their base defensive structure, according to this, is kind of is like a 4 down, 5 down front. So basically, what he reminds me of is kind of that on-ball linebacker, Sam linebacker that you saw in Seattle, like as a base structure. Now, how often are they in this base structure? I don't know. Probably not a whole bunch, honestly. You know what I'm saying? Like when you think about what Seattle was doing, like they were like, oh yeah, we have 40 linemen. We have a big edge shedding player, in this instance, Dante Fowler. But again, that edge player in sub becomes an edge rusher. So I think that's kind of what they're looking at there. It's not your classic off-ball linebacker. It's more like a 55 front or a 25 front where you're playing. Sorry, those are numbers. People don't know what those mean. You're playing like if you've got a tight end, which is the offensive strength, right? You're going to have a 5 technique. So a player on the inside shoulder of the tight end. You're going to have a Sam linebacker on the outside shoulder of the tight end. And basically you can gap out the front side or the strength of the offensive formation in base offense. Now, Dallas, if that was their base structure, they were in that like less than 15% of the time last year. But that's how they're going to call it to start. And so I think that's why you get Dante Fowler, Jamin Javis, like listed as like an outside linebacker type. Think of it more as like a defensive end, edge setting, kind of Ryan Kerrigan in a 3-4, that type of player.
Do you think Fowler's more comfortable standing up or with his hand in the dirt?
So I definitely think hand in the dirt. I mean, he's a defensive lineman, but I do think that like he has played in multiple systems. He's played in a 3-4 where you have kind of your big 3 interior players, then you've got those 2 edge guys. And those edge guys, again, are like your Ryan Kerrigans, your Brian Arakpos that will play in a 2-point, but they are moving forward from that 2-point. Your Aldon Smiths, your DeMarcus Wares, like your Von Millers. Like no one would ever confuse them with an off-ball linebacker. They are rushers. And so they line up in a 2-point. They also line up in a 3-point. And I think that's what the athleticism of Dante Fowler gives you. Again, he's kind of been all over the place from a career standpoint, but like he's still a tremendous athlete watching him in practice. He's got a great feel for rushing the passer. So he's going to kind of use all those tricks, 3-point, 2-point, spins, stabs, long arms, all that kind of stuff. But he's an edge rusher. And again, in base defense, he'll set that strong side edge for you. But I don't know how much you're going to be doing that given, how much sub NFL teams are playing.
Best part about this unofficial depth chart, it was released on Tuesday, and 50 hours later, they have a joint practice with the Jets, and it might mean absolutely nothing. And speaking of that joint practice, that's where we're headed next. A joint practice with the Jets, a preseason game with the Jets, and everything we just talked about likely to change. We'll tackle that when we get back. He's Logan Paulsen. I'm Denton Day. It's Take Command Podcast. Take Command Podcast, Denton Day, sitting in for Craig Hoffman this week. He'll be back this weekend, returning from France. Logan Paulsen with me as always. It's joint practice week this week, Logan. They're headed up to Jersey. You're spending some time with the Jets. Got a preseason game with the Jets on Saturday. It'll be our first real look at a lot of these new players in the Commanders' burgundy and gold. But I want to start with the joint practices. First priority, please don't fight nearly as much as the Giants and the Lions have been doing over their first couple of days of the joint practice. But you've had the opportunity in your NFL career to partake in a couple of joint practices. What is the overall feel after you've been spending a lot of time squaring up against your own guys to go and see somebody else?
Yeah, so I think joint practices for players are a little bit stressful. Some people I know like them. Like Fred was talking about how much he enjoyed them, kind of being able to talk smack to a different group of people, which I totally understand. That's Fred's prerogative. I just always found the tempo of the practice was a little hard to determine. So what I mean by that is like, when you go to practice against your own guys every day, this is the expectation. It's this fast, or it's 100 miles an hour, or it's 85 miles an hour for this period, or whatever that looks like. When you go with a different team, you're always kind of like, there's certain things where you're like, this is full speed, and then they aren't playing at full speed, or they're maybe playing faster than you, and you're like trying to match and meet them. And there's a little bit of a feeling out period, which I always found as a player to be very, very frustrating. And then you get to this thing where it does get very competitive. It feels like a game. So obviously the joint practice I was a part of, it was like 3 days of joint practice. Again, which can be a little bit stressful on the body because every day imagine if you had 3 games in a row, like you'd be a little bit worked. So one of the things I like that Dan's done or doing now is we're just going up there for one practice. And, you talked about the fighting in the New York, Detroit thing. What I found is that in all of my years of doing joint practices, so 3 years, so 3 joint practices, is it's not the first day. It's sometimes the second day, but it's for sure the third day you will fight. For sure the third day. Because what happens is like the first day, let's say, I remember we did this versus Houston. Like we went out and we quote unquote won the first day. Like we just had better energy. We kind of made some plays and we were excited about it. We felt really good about it. And then, that year the Houston Texans were on Hard Knocks. And so we got to go watch them that night, and Bill O'Brien is in there screaming about how like they won the day and we need to win the day. And so they came out and kind of stuck it to us the second day. So again, then that night Jay Gruden comes on and says they got after our ass. We got to get after them now. And then all of a sudden on the third day, everyone is just like we have to fight basically to get to match the intensity of the other team. So I think you need like a mature coaching staff. Like when we had our joint practice with the New England Patriots and Bill Belichick was running the show, there was no chance of fighting because there was like such a high standard that Bill Belichick brought in terms of his professionalism. When I was in San Fran, like I think we just did 2 days and then split up the third day because we could feel the fight coming, so there was no fight there. So if you handle kind of your expectations as a coach, you handle your communication to the players, it's very, very unlikely that a fight will break out if you handle it appropriately. And I do think that, Dan Quinn knows Robert Saleh very, very well. He knows Ulbrich, the linebacker, the defensive coordinator now. They're very, very well. They've worked together before. So I think they'll be able to get the practice tempo, practice cadence communicated and work together as opposed to making it some type of adversarial experience.
So I'm curious because you've walked through this before. Typically during the training camp days, the thought is that you're not exactly doing a ton in terms of some of the stuff that you're going to do in this season because you got a bunch of media there to watch it. You got a bunch of, and especially in recent years, you got a bunch of fans for the Commanders who are out there watching it, and you don't want somebody to tape something that then makes its way onto social media. Do you install a little bit more when it comes to joint practices, or is it still just relatively basic and doing kind of the stuff you've been doing?
That's a great question. And to say that what Cliff and what Joe Witt Jr. have been doing is relatively basic, I think is underselling what they've done this training camp. They've done a lot of stuff that Joe hasn't done before. Like they're trying new things. They're branching out. They're working on pressures. They're working on timing. They're working on personnel, both offensively and defensively. And I was watching the offensive practice and I'm like, man, they have a lot in, and they've got a hurry up. They've got all these motions and shifts and different personnels, and no one's messing it up. And they're all seem to be on the same page. So I think one of the benefits of joint practice is that you can carry some of that over. You can kind of bring that in. And so when we do team period, I remember with New England, they would run like their base defense, and you'd see some different coverage disguises. You'd see some more exotic pressures than you would see against different teams, in the preseason, for example, because they knew it wasn't going to be on film. And I remember like Kyle, I guess it was with Sean, we would actually kind of game plan for the Houston Texans or the New England Patriots when they came to town. But then the preseason game was like our day 1, day 2 install, like the most basic versions of our offense, like no game planning at all. So I do think that the joint practice allows you as a coordinator to present more information and more of your offense and get a feel for what's working, what doesn't work. Does this run hit versus a different defensive structure? Are we physical enough to get this done? Does this concept create the space that we're hoping for, that we've been seeing in our defense? So I do think the joint practice is a great tool for coaches to kind of check out their system, for evaluators to evaluate the roster. Because again, it's not only am I evaluating our roster, the Commanders roster, but I'm also evaluating how it stacks up to the Jets roster. And the Jets are supposed to be a team that's going to make some waves in the NFL this year, hopefully a playoff team for them. How does our roster stack up? Maybe we're not that far off. Maybe, the rebuild's gotten better than expected, whatever that looks like. So I think the joint practice is great for coaches and talent evaluators. Kind of sucks for players, but I do think Dan's handled it the right way in terms of they got kind of their travel day, rest day today, practice tomorrow, another rest day before the preseason game. It's going to mitigate the risk of a fight. It's going to keep those guys feeling fresh and healthy, and also allow them to be focused. So I think this is about the best way you could do it. And so those players who hate it, they're just going to have to suck it up. But because it does do a lot, it provides a lot of advantage for the other elements of the football team.
So because the offense has already put some things in there that they will likely be using once the season starts, and taking into consideration that they're not playing the Jets at all this year, fingers crossed, unless it's in February, do you think there will be some element of, hey, we have this look, can you guys try and, I don't know if give us a certain look that we can run a play or a series of plays against, but because that you mentioned there is a relationship between the two head guys, and because you're not going to play them during the regular season, do you think there is a little more flexibility in terms of help us with this and we're going to help you with this kind of deal?
I do think so. I think, that's one of the beauties of a joint practice. In addition to the schematic stuff, it's like, hey man, let's run a 7-on-7. Let's do a team run, and we're only going to run gap scheme runs. Or let's do a third and short, and let's make sure that we're only in 22 personnel or whatever. Like, you can be really specific with what you're doing. And I think that's something that makes joint practices better in some ways than the preseason. Like, so for example, if I want Sam Hartman to work a 2-minute drill, I can just be like, hey, 3s are up, 4s are up, working 2 minute, let's go right now. And I can see what he looks like. I don't have to there's no like, oh, let's hope he gets a 2-minute at the end of the game, or let's hope he gets a 2-minute at the end of half. Like, I am in total control of that. So I think that's something that I would just say yes. And I think having the relationship with the other coach allows them to kind of be symbiotic in their relationship, or reciprocal in the relationship. Like, hey, we really want to see this in our third down stuff. Can you be in, more spread stuff today or whatever for this period? And sure, can you bring some of these blitzes? We're trying to work on our protections. Like, I think that's how it's going to go. And I think, you probably have some type of similar conversation about what you're going to do in the preseason, but I do think what you're doing in the practice is a little bit more advanced.
So as we get there, we'll look at matchups. And speaking of matchups, that's what we're going to tackle when we get back. Who are the matchups that we would like to see in this joint practice? And then ultimately when we get to the preseason game. He's Logan Paulsen. I'm Denton. It's Take Command Podcast. Take Command Podcast, Denton Day and Logan Paulsen. Craig will be back next week. Should be getting back from Paris in the next couple of days or so. With the joint practice coming up, Logan, there are a couple of matchups that I'm really excited about. And I think the first one, hoping that Brandon Coleman is going to be a full participant, is just to see what he is going to look like against this Jets defensive line. The Jets offense, when Aaron Rodgers got hurt last year, was atrocious, but their head was above water for a majority of the season because the defense was insane. And Robert Saleh has done a really good job of making it a focal point to have a bunch of really good dudes on that defensive line. So I am really excited to see what a guy like Brandon Coleman, who's getting his first action against somebody else in the NFL, to see what he can do. But I've also been kind of a firm believer this offseason that while the offensive line wasn't by any stretch great last year, I don't think they were nearly as bad as people wanted to make them out to be last year. And that's for a number of different reasons. But I'm excited to see what the offensive line is going to look like against a Jets defensive front that has a lot of really high expectations this year.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you got Jermaine Johnson, you've got Quentin Williams, you got a whole bunch of guys on that front that are special or could be special. They've got Will McDonald, who was a first-round pass rush specialist. That's kind of their 2 rotational guy, right? They've got Hassan Reddick, who probably won't practice, but they've got a lot of juice on that defensive front. And so I do think it's a great test, not only for Brandon Coleman, but the entire group. Like, when we're in one-on-ones, if they chose to do that, or in team pass or in team blitz, like, let's see how those one-on-ones look, man. Let's see if we can match the intensity, the speed of this group. And so I think that's great. I also think, on the outside, just everybody versus that defense, I think, is a win. Sauce Gardner versus Terry McLaurin, right? Like, think about that matchup. Mosley versus B-Rob. Like, there's so many different narratives and just ways to kind of see where the roster's at, like, that I think are awesome. Like, it's the same thing. Like, when we went up against when I was in San Fran and we went up against the Denver Broncos and Von Miller was there. It's like, we thought we had a pretty good pass rush, and then we saw Von Miller, and we're like, oh no, actually we don't. And so I think that's what this will show you, and it'll show where guys are, and that's why we're doing this. That's why we're playing this game, right? Is to kind of say, hey, Terry's looked good against Forbes and Davis, but how's he look against Sauce? And maybe he looks as good against Sauce as he does against Forbes, like hypothetically speaking. You say, well, maybe Forbes isn't having that rough of a camp after all, or whatever it looks like. Not that Forbes had a rough camp, but I'm saying those couple of explosives Terry catches, obviously he's doing that to everybody. So I'm ecstatic to check that group out. In terms of Brandon Coleman specifically, I think it's just, I can't wait. For him, he's like the one person I cannot wait to see. Because if he looks good, how special would that be for this organization to find a quarterback of the future and a left tackle of the future in their first draft on rookie contracts? That's like Christmas for any football fan.
That's what I've been dreaming about and praying about really since they hired Adam Peters. Now I'm curious because you mentioned that you were a part of the joint practices with here with the Houston Texans and the New England Patriots. The Houston stuff I think a lot of fans remember because the video that goes viral, it feels like every single year with DeAndre Hopkins and D'Angelo Hall. But I remember those practices with New England for like one little soundbite. I don't even know if it was a soundbite or if it was just a quote after where Robert had asked Tom Brady for advice, and Tom Brady was, "I will give it to you when I retire." And then one of those two guys played another 10 years and won 4 Super Bowls. Jeez Louise. And then the other guy, unfortunately, was not here that much longer. Do you think Aaron Rodgers is going to be nicer to Jayden Daniels than Tom Brady was to Robert?
What's funny is this is maybe a little aside. I actually thought Tom Brady was really cool. I remember him coming over and talking to Jordan Reed about how he ran routes and how he saw stuff. And, and so I do think there are things that guys are willing to share and there are things guys are not willing to share. And it's just about how you talk and communicate through some of that, because guys aren't going to give you all their trade secrets, but when I was playing with Kirk was dogmatic about talking with multiple different quarterbacks. He used to talk to Drew Brees, they had an agent crossover or something, and he would pick Drew Brees' brain all the time. And Drew Brees was very, very accessible. And there was some of that stuff, not everything, but a lot of stuff. And I think there are things Aaron's going to talk about and help Jayden with, and there are things he's going to be like, "Hey man, you got to figure this out." And I think that's totally appropriate, because that's how some of those top end quarterbacks kind of keep their edge, is kind of saying, "I have this thing that no one else does that's mine." And I think that's totally reasonable.
I would love to see from Jayden in the joint practice, and I kind of hope, I don't know if New York does this. I would really love it if they did what Baltimore did last year, which is stream it. So those of us that are not in New Jersey can get a good idea of kind of what's happening. But I really hope that we see some of the stuff we talked about on our previous episode earlier this week about Jayden's command of the offense and knowing everybody's role and having that command at the line of scrimmage. I really hope that we see the continuation of that against somebody else when it's a team on the other side that doesn't have your best interest at heart, because you are not supposed to be the savior of that organization. I hope that all the good things that we see really continue against somebody else in what I'm sure will be a somewhat hostile environment.
Yeah, I talked about Brandon Coleman and how excited I am for him. I probably was being over enthusiastic because really the number one evaluation data point in this joint practice is Jayden Daniels, the number one thing. If he looks good, if he looks like he can handle what the defense is presenting, if he looks like he can still play with the same level of confidence and anticipation and speed, then I think we're going to be all right. But that's a big if. And that's why we're doing the joint practice, is to see if it's effective, right? See if he can be effective. And so, if you are a reporter, like I know Kime and Bram were going up there to watch practice, if you talk to anybody, all they want to see is him, because I think everyone understands that if he goes and he's successful, this organization and this franchise is going to be successful. Maybe not this year, maybe not 2 years from now, but sooner rather than later. So that's a huge point, and it's the same thing for the Miami joint practice. So really can't wait for him. Can't wait to see what he's presenting and what he brings, and I hopefully he looks as sharp or close to as sharp as he's done the last couple of weeks here in Washington.
On the defensive side, I'm really excited for whether it's Forbes, St. Juiced, Michael Davis. Hell, even Mikey Sanders still.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Garrett Wilson. I have been since he was in college. Watching him in college at Ohio State, the guy was insane. I'm excited to see those guys work with him, work against him. He's been a guy that has suffered, at least statistically, because there really have not been a lot of good quarterbacks to throw him the football outside of Rodgers for 4 plays. But I'm really excited to see what they can match up against him, because it's one thing, right? Like Forbes has had some success against Terry McLaurin, and St. Juste has had success this offseason as well. But I think it is a different element when you're not only doing that against a really good wide receiver who is one of the next up and coming guys in this league in Garrett Wilson, but then also when Aaron Rodgers is the one throwing him the football, because we have about 20 years of history that showcases that Aaron Rodgers doesn't exactly make a ton of mistakes.
No, I think that's 100% right. I think, that's that relation, especially because you're going to get to see Aaron Rodgers in the practice, right, as opposed to in the game. And so you're going to get to see that tremendous arm talent, that tremendous ball placement, all those different things that he brings with Garrett Wilson, who to me, like you said, is one of the best kind of up-and-coming receivers in the NFL. So, I don't know. I think it's going to be a great opportunity to kind of see, again, where the secondary is at as a whole. Because talk about a guy who won't get flustered by pressure. Talk about a guy who's going to be able to find the best matchup. Talk about the guy who's going to throw it to space like Aaron Rodgers, man. And with maybe the best arm in football. So I think, I'm not going to be able to go because I have other commitments. But that is going to be something like whoever's covering that, I definitely want to hear. I want to see about it because I think that's going to be really telling.
So the game itself this weekend, 12 p.m. Eastern time, Commanders and Jets. What are you hoping to leave that game with? We'll likely see the starters 10 plays, maybe 14 if we're super lucky. What are you hoping to leave that game with after watching some of the starters and some of the backups?
Yeah, I mean, I really think this is a game that's going to be more for the backups. It's the first preseason game, so what the starters are going to play, I don't know, 10 snaps, maybe 10, I don't know, 15. And so, when the starters are in, I want them to be sharp. I want them to be crisp. Like, that's what I want. Efficient, offensively, defensively. Are we communicating? Are we getting things checked? Are we in the right position? Are we making tackles? Right. And then as we go down, I want to see those guys that are going to compose the back half of the roster. I want to see them and how they look. I want to see, the Dominique Hamptons, the Tyler Owens, the Norrell Pallards, the Benny Potoais, like, those guys that are going to fill this sucker out, like, what do they look like? We talked about Bryson Tremaine already, but Mitchell Tinsley, does Jamison Crowder look good returning punts? Does he kind of carve out a niche for himself? Does Luke McCaffrey catch the football? Those young running backs, the young tight ends, the backup offensive line, like that. The thing, this is the thing. Is one of the reasons the depth chart is so subjective is because this evaluation point hasn't occurred yet, and now as fans, we have an opportunity to get a true evaluation of what they're doing. So I really can't wait for the game. I think it's going to be awesome. Again, it's going to be simple. It's nothing going to be too complicated, but I think it's going to provide a great opportunity for us to understand more clearly this depth chart and what the coaching staff is thinking.
There's 2 guys that I really want to see perform well outside of Jane Daniels because, I want to see the quarterback play well. I've heard a lot of good things about Jordan McGee. I love when I'm sitting there watching, if I keep seeing his name and his number pop up, and then I am hopeful because I'm rooting for him. I'm hopeful Jamin makes at least a play or 2. That makes you say, like, all right, this is moving in the right direction. I want to see him do well. I will admit, a little nervous about that. But that's what I'm hoping for. Logan, you're the man. I'm excited for this weekend, my friend. I look forward to talking again. Thank you for having me for the week. And Craig, I'm sure Craig's itching to get back with you.
Yeah, man. Thanks for helping us out, man. You did a great job, and it's always a pleasure.
He is Logan Paulsen. I'm Denton Day. Craig is back next week. Everybody enjoy the preseason game this weekend. This has been the Take Command podcast.
Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.